The year is 1970. The location is Palin Air Base, deep in the humid heart of South Vietnam. The Vietnam War is at its bloody peak, a meat grinder consuming the youth of America. Every day, military transport planes, huge C-141 Starlifters, lumber down the runway, their bellies filled with the tragic cargo of war. They are carrying aluminum coffins, draped in the stars and stripes, heading home to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. To the military, police, and the grieving families back home, these planes are sacred hearses. But to a man named Frank Lucas, watching from the shadows of the tarmac, they are something else entirely. They are the ultimate Trojan horse. Frank Lucas, a gangster from Harlem, had a problem. He wanted to import high-grade heroin into the United States, but the Italian Mafia controlled the ports. They charged a tax, a massive markup that bled the profits dry. Lucas needed a way to bypass the mob. He needed a smuggling route that no customs agent would dare to search. He found it in the dead bodies of American soldiers. This operation, known in the annals of criminal history as the Cadaver Connection, remains one of the most morbidly ingenious smuggling schemes ever devised. The logistics were terrifyingly simple. Lucas had established a connection with a U.S. Army sergeant, Leslie Ike Atkinson, who worked in the chaos of the Bangkok military infrastructure. Together, they realized that the flow of coffins was the only cargo stream that was never delayed and rarely inspected. According to Lucas's own account, a claim that has terrified and fascinated the public for decades, he flew a carpenter from North Carolina to Bangkok. The carpenter's job was to build false bottoms into the standard-issue government coffins. In the stifling heat of a warehouse near the airbase, they would pack kilos of China White, heroin of 98% purity, into the hidden compartments. Then the heavy aluminum coffins containing the remains of fallen soldiers were placed on top. Imagine the scene: the roar of jet engines, the smell of jet fuel and jungle rot, the solemn respect paid to the coffins by the ground crew, and hidden inches beneath the honored dead lay the white death that would destroy the living in Harlem. When the planes landed at Dover Air Force Base, unsuspecting military personnel would unload the cargo. Lucas had arranged for the coffins to be transported to a specific holding area. There, his crew would retrieve the drugs before the bodies were sent to the funeral homes. It was a ghost operation. By using the dead to traffic narcotics, Frank Lucas did what no other black gangster had ever done. He cut out the Italian Mafia completely. He paid zero tax. He brought the purest heroin ever seen in New York directly from the Golden Triangle to 116th Street. He was making $1 million a day, but this level of cold calculation doesn't appear out of thin air. Frank Lucas wasn't born a mastermind. He was made one. To understand the man who could look at a coffin and see a shipping container, we have to go back to the streets of Harlem in the 1960s. We have to go back to the man who taught him everything. The Cadaver Connection proved that Frank Lucas had no lines he wouldn't cross. He was a man of absolute pragmatism. But he didn't learn this ruthlessness in Vietnam. He learned it in the back seat of a Cadillac in Harlem. Before he was a kingpin using dead soldiers as mules, he was just a driver. But he wasn't driving for just anyone. He was driving for the most dangerous man in New York. In the early 1960s, Harlem was a kingdom, and its king was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was an intellectual gangster, a man who played chess, read philosophy, and enforced his will with a switchblade. He was the barrier that kept the Italian Mafia from completely overrunning Harlem. Frank Lucas arrived in New York from North Carolina with nothing but a reputation for violence. He had fled the South after allegedly beating up a white employer. In Harlem, he found his calling. He became Bumpy Johnson's collector, then his bodyguard, and finally, his driver. For 15 years, Frank Lucas sat in the front seat, watching Bumpy Johnson work. This was his university. He learned the code of silence. He learned that a gangster must be a pillar of the community, handing out turkeys on Thanksgiving, paying rent for widows, and protecting the neighborhood. Bumpy taught him that if the people love you, the police can never find you. But he also learned the economics of crime. Lucas watched as Bumpy Johnson negotiated with the Italian five families, the Genovese, the Gambinos. He saw that the Italians respected Bumpy, but they still controlled the supply. The Italians brought the heroin into the country, stepped on it, diluted it, and sold it to the black dealers at a premium. Bumpy was powerful, but he was still a customer. Frank Lucas absorbed these lessons silently. He saw the flaw in the system. As long as you bought from the Italians, you were a second-class citizen. The end of the era came in 1968. The location was Wells Restaurant in Harlem, famous for its chicken and waffles. Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas were eating. According to Lucas, Bumpy was complaining about the changing world, about how the police were getting harder to bribe, and the Italians were getting greedier. Suddenly, Bumpy clutched his chest. He collapsed. In that chaotic moment, as the king of Harlem lay dying on the floor of a diner, Frank Lucas didn't just see a tragedy. He saw a vacuum. Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in Frank's arms. The crown was lying in the gutter, waiting for someone to pick it up. Most people expected a war for succession. They expected the Italians to move in and take over Harlem completely. But Frank Lucas had a different plan. He realized that trying to be the next Bumpy, Johnson was small thinking. He didn't want to negotiate with the Italians. He wanted to replace them. Bumpy Johnson's death severed the last link to the old way of doing things. Frank Lucas looked at the heroin market in New York and saw a scam. The Mafia was selling product that was barely 10% pure, filled with milk sugar and quinine, and charging exorbitant prices. Lucas knew that if he wanted to rule New York, he couldn't just be a tougher gangster. He had to be a better businessman. He needed a product that no one else had. And to get it, he had to go to the end of the earth. In 1969, while other Harlem hustlers were fighting over street corners, Frank Lucas got on a plane. He flew to Bangkok, Thailand. It was a journey into the unknown. At the time, no African-American gangster operated internationally. It was a world of spies, warlords, and military corruption. Lucas was walking into the Golden Triangle, the lawless border region where Thailand, Burma, and Laos meet, the opium capital of the world. Lucas wandered the bars of Bangkok looking for a connection. He found it in an unlikely place, a black servicemen's club. There, he met Leslie Ike Atkinson, a U.S. Army sergeant who was married to a Thai woman and knew the landscape. Ike was the key. He wasn't a gangster. He was a logistics expert. Together, they didn't just buy drugs in the city. They went to the source. The story of Frank Lucas, trekking into the jungle, is one of the surreal chapters of criminal history. Imagine a black man from North Carolina, dressed in a safari suit, hiking through the dense, leech-infested rainforests of northern Thailand on an elephant. He was heading for the camps of the opium warlords, men who commanded private armies. When Lucas arrived at the poppy fields, he was stunned. He saw mountains of raw opium paste. He negotiated directly with the farmers and the refiners. He bought heroin that was 98% pure. It was white, fluffy, and deadly. Back in New York, the Mafia was selling diluted brown sludge. Lucas was holding pharmaceutical-grade poison. But the most important part of the deal was the price. By cutting out the Italian middlemen, the Turkish syndicates, and the French connection, Lucas was buying a kilo of heroin for $4,200. That same kilo, once cut and sold on the streets of New York, was worth $300,000. The profit margin was not just high, it was astronomical. It was the kind of money that builds empires. Lucas branded his product Blue Magic. He sold it in blue glassine bags. He refused to step on it too much. He put it on the street at 10% purity, which was double the strength of the Mafia's Brand X. When Blue Magic hit the streets of Harlem, it hit like a tidal wave. Junkies were overdosing on the first hit because they weren't used to the quality. But in the twisted logic of addiction, the overdoses were the best advertisement. It meant the stuff was strong. Frank Lucas had achieved the impossible. He was a black man in a white man's world, and he was winning. He had the best product, the lowest price, and a supply chain protected by the U.S. military. But with great success comes a fatal flaw: the need to show it off. Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day. He bought real estate across the country. He bought cattle ranches. He had Cayman Island bank accounts. He was ghost-like, staying out of the press, keeping a low profile just as Bumpy Johnson had taught him. The police knew someone was flooding Harlem with high-grade dope, but they didn't know who the ghost was. He was winning the game because he was invisible. But ego is a powerful drug. And on a cold night in 1971, Frank Lucas decided to step out of the shadows and wear a coat that would cost him his life. The date was March 8th, 1971, Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. The entire world was watching. Frank Sinatra was taking photos ringside. Barbra Streisand was in the audience. The heavy hitters of the Mafia were there, wearing dark, understated suits. They knew that when you are a criminal, you don't advertise. Then Frank Lucas walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a floor-length chinchilla coat. It was a coat that cost $100,000, more than most Americans made in a decade. And to complete the outfit, he wore a matching $25,000 chinchilla hat. The coat was screaming. It was a massive, gray, furry monument to arrogance. Frank Lucas walked down the aisle to his ringside seat, a seat better than the Italian Mafia bosses had. He sat down, shook hands with celebrities, and smiled for the cameras. But watching from the shadows were the eyes of the law. Detectives from the newly formed Special Narcotics Prosecutor's Office were present. They saw the coat. They saw the seat. And they asked a simple question. Who is the black guy with the better seat than the Gambinos? That coat was a beacon. Before that, night. Frank Lucas was a rumor. After that night, he was a target. Richie Roberts, a relentless New Jersey detective, began to dig. He started tracking the blue bags of Blue Magic. He started connecting the dots between the deaths in Harlem and the money flowing through New Jersey. The investigation was grueling. Lucas was careful. He used only family members, his country boys from North Carolina, as lieutenants. He didn't trust outsiders. He didn't use the telephone. But the coat had put him on the radar. The police began to follow him. They surveilled his family. They tracked the money laundering. They waited for a mistake. And the mistake came from the very success of the operation. The sheer volume of cash was impossible to hide. Lucas was washing money through dry cleaners, gas stations, and travel agencies. But the cash was piling up in plastic bags in his attic. The chinchilla coat didn't convict him, but it signed his warrant. It was the moment Frank Lucas forgot. the most important rule of the underworld. The loudest man in the room is the first one to leave. The police had the target. Now they needed the evidence. They spent years building the case, chipping away at the country boys, turning low-level dealers, and mapping the empire. In January 1975, the hammer finally fell. The cadaver connection, the blue magic, and the millions of dollars came crashing down in a raid that would end the reign of the King of Harlem. The raid on Frank Lucas's house in Teaneck, New Jersey, was a military operation. Agents from the DEA and the NYPD smashed through the doors. They found Frank Lucas in his pajamas. But more importantly, they found the money. They found $584,000 in cash, stuffed into paper bags. They found the keys to Cayman Island safe deposit boxes. The evidence was overwhelming. Frank Lucas was arrested and put on trial. The government threw the book at him. He was sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. 70 years. It was a death sentence. Frank Lucas was looking at dying in a concrete box. But Frank Lucas was a survivor. He sat in his cell and realized he had one card left to play. He had something the government wanted more than him. He had the Italians. For years, Lucas had hated the Mafia for their tax, their disrespect, and their control. Now he could use them to buy his freedom. In a move that shocked the underworld, the man who preached the code of silence turned informant. He became a rat. Frank Lucas sat down with Richie Roberts, the very man who caught him, and opened the book. He didn't just give up his own crew. He gave up the crooked police officers who had been shaking him down for years. He gave up the Italian connections he had dealt with. His testimony was devastating. It led to more than 100 convictions. He decimated the criminal landscape of New York. Because of his cooperation, his 70-year sentence was reduced. He was released in 1981 after serving only 5 years. But the story has a final, bitter twist. Frank Lucas tried to go straight, but the streets were in his blood. He was caught trying to sell a kilogram of heroin in 1984 and was sent back to prison for another 7 years. When he finally walked out for the last time in 1991, he was an old man. The Harlem he ruled was gone. The blue magic was a memory. The chinchilla coat was moth-eaten history. Frank Lucas spent his final years in a wheelchair, a relic of a bygone era. He died in 2019 at the age of 88. His legacy is a complicated tapestry of American ambition and destruction. He was a genius of logistics who poisoned his own community. He was a black icon who stood up to the Mafia, only to betray everyone to save himself. But the image that endures is not the old man in the wheelchair. It is the image of the runway at Palin Air Base, the roar of the engines, the stars and stripes draped over aluminum boxes, and the chilling realization that one man looked at the tragic cost of war and saw nothing but a shipping lane for poison. Frank Lucas proved that in the pursuit of the American dream, some men are willing to walk through a nightmare and drag the rest of the world with them.